Humans routinely set high-friction goals, launching a business, running ultramarathons. Yet our underlying neurobiology is engineered for the exact opposite: extreme energy conservation. When you sit down to execute a difficult task and feel a heavy wave of inertia, that is not laziness. Your brain's baseline coding is actively interpreting the expenditure of cognitive or physical energy as a literal biological threat. Popular culture treats willpower as a fleeting emotion, a moral virtue, or a byproduct of high motivation. If you just care enough, the friction is supposed to disappear. The clinical data tells a completely different story. Over the last few years, clinical neurobiologists and peak performance researchers have dismantled this psychological illusion. Laboratories at institutions like Stanford University are mapping the specific neural pathways that compute effort and cost. They have found that willpower is a hardwired, measurable calculation, executed by very specific circuitry in the brain. In this 3D cross-section of the brain, motivation stems from the ventral tegmental area and planning from the prefrontal cortex. But the effort calculation occurs in a specific hub, the anterior mid-cingulate cortex. The AMCC is the engine for tenacity, the bottleneck for all goal persistence. Like a muscle, this region exhibits neuroplasticity. The human brain has the structural capacity to physically grow and strengthen this specific neural network over time. But the clinical literature outlines a strict, counterintuitive condition for this growth. The AMCC exhibits neuroplasticity exclusively under conditions of active aversion. Completing a highly demanding task does not build this circuitry if you actually enjoy the process. Aversion is the biological prerequisite of growth. The neurobiological center for willpower only hypertrophies when you voluntarily force yourself to engage in physical or cognitive friction that you actively hate. To see why this matters, look at the modern baseline. Most of our daily environment is optimized for high-frequency, low-friction dopamine, infinite scrolling, algorithmic feeds, and digital notifications. This environment constantly overstimulates the brain's reward pathway without requiring any corresponding physical or mental effort. This visualization shows the mechanical consequence of that lifestyle. Heavy reliance on cheap dopamine physically taxes and reduces the neural density of the prefrontal cortex, the brain's executive control center. You are left with a weakened system trying to balance effort cost against reward value. An atrophied prefrontal cortex warps the brain's ability to calculate reality. In this weakened state, the brain miscomputes minor necessary tasks. Answering an email or doing 30 minutes of deep work is suddenly registered as requiring a dangerous, overwhelming level of energy expenditure. Relying on motivation and dopamine to drive productivity is a biological trap. It actively shrinks the executive control required to sustain long-term focus. Think about the exact moment of cognitive friction, when a difficult, highly aversive task is sitting immediately in front of you and you want to quit. This network diagram maps how your brain processes that moment. The first data input comes from the amygdala and hypothalamus, which flood the brain with stress signals demanding immediate energy preservation. Simultaneously, the prefrontal cortex sends a competing, often weaker signal representing your long-term goals and rational execution. The anterior mid-cingulate cortex acts as the master calculation hub. It sits directly in the middle, weighing the intense physiological stress signals against the logical, abstractical signals. If the AMCC has sufficient neural density, it successfully overrides the amygdala's panic and pushes an execution signal outward to the motor cortex. This is what that neurological override looks like in extreme physical execution. Willpower is not a mystical force. It is the mathematical victory of the AMCC overriding the brain's hardwired stress and energy preservation alarms. If the AMCC is the biological bottleneck for willpower, the obvious question is how we increase its structural density. We can plot the clinical framework for this on a simple matrix. The x-axis measures task difficulty, and the y-axis measures subjective enjoyment. Take a subject performing a grueling task they genuinely love, like an avid runner completing a marathon. Because their subjective enjoyment is high, the data shows zero activation or growth in the AMCC. Contrast this with a subject forcing themselves to perform a task they despise and actively resist. When high difficulty meets low enjoyment, we see intense, glowing activation of the AMCC. This is the mechanism behind microdosing voluntary friction. It requires extreme physical or cognitive discomfort paired with a total lack of subjective enjoyment. To upgrade the hardware of the brain, difficulty is simply not enough. The brain must consciously register active resistance, and you must deliberately choose to conquer the aversion. This time-lapse visualization shows the anatomical result of repeatedly microdosing voluntary friction. The AMCC region physically thickens and increases in neural density. A denser AMCC manages systemic stress across the body by regulating and suppressing the amygdala's fear responses. Clinical research indicates that strengthening this prefrontal circuitry can actually reverse age-related cognitive decline and fiercely protect working memory. Look back at our original scale. With a hypertrophied AMCC, your new behavioral baseline changes. Future friction requires significantly less computational energy to overcome because the brain is finally assessing the effort accurately. The human brain will always default to the path of least resistance. True executive control is not achieved by finding life hacks to enjoy hard work. Instead, it is achieved by biologically forcing the brain to process, endure, and conquer exactly what it hates.